Hi, and welcome to Haley's How To's. Today we'll be getting into Vlookup, Hlookup, and Xlookup functions in Excel, when they're used, why they're used, and the differences between them. And so we'll go ahead and jump in to today's content. I will start by giving a quick screen share and open my Excel file that we'll be working from. Okay, so once everyone hopefully sees my screen, now the first thing we're going to cover is VLOOKUP. All right, then we'll go into HLOOKUP and then we'll finalize everything with the XLOOKUP function and explain how it is proving the other two to be obsolete as it kind of can do both functions. So let's go to the first tab, VLOOKUP. You'll see here that we have some NFL football players and the teams that they are on or were on, and Super Bowl wins, MVP awards, rushing yards, etc. for the Super Bowls they played in. So this was just a quick ChatGPT prompting that generated some of this data so that I could show you the VLOOKUP. So what we're going to be doing is on this Perform Analysis tab, I'm actually going to be pulling in the information that we need. So the first thing we'll pull in is team name to show you how the VLOOKUP works. Well, why would we need a VLOOKUP? Couldn't we just see the team names and copy and paste them into this sheet? Absolutely, right? That would be very easy and feasible with, you know, 10, 11 players. However, if we had data that was 1,000 rows long, you would not want to go and manually copy and paste. And you'll notice that these names, these player names, are in a different order than the player names on the analysis tab. So I'm trying to pull in their team names. And if I had to do this for 1,000 players, I would definitely want a VLOOKUP function. So that's how it could be useful, right? It's honestly a copy and paste function, right? A fancy copy and paste. But what it's doing is copying and pasting things when your reference, such as player, is out of order or a different order than you need. So let's go ahead. So we'll say VLOOKUP equals VLOOKUP, and we're just going to pull in all of these players' team names, all right, from the original tab. So what are we looking up? The lookup value is the player name, all right? And it has to be in the same format. So you might have to do some data cleaning, and I'll actually have a video on data cleaning on my YouTube channel as well. It is not up yet, but it will be up soon. So if your data is not in a clean format that's consistent with how you need it, I can show you how to do that as well. But right now, luckily, our player names are in the correct format, so it will find Von Miller. So we're going to say VLOOKUP Von Miller, comma, that's our lookup value, right? And then the table array we're looking from, got to click on the table we're going to be pulling from. It's going to be, whoops, A to B. So we're basically pulling from this list of player names in any order, what team are they associated with? All right, and so in that case, when I highlight it, notice that it tells me I'm going 2 columns over. All right, in that little box that pops up, that's telling me that I need to go 2 over if this is the column I want to pull in. For example, what if I wanted to pull in not team, but MVP awards? Well, then I would need to go 4 columns over to pull in that data. So that'll come in handy in just a second. So let's go ahead and highlight the data. So we're saying VLOOKUP between these 2 columns, all right? And what are we trying to find? Value 2, which is the team name. It's saying out of these columns, right, that I've selected 2 columns, I want to pull a result from column 2. Okay, I'm using column A, all right, to look up the player name, and I'm pulling in the team name from column 2. All right, and I'm going to say comma false, which is just telling the VLOOKUP function to give me an exact match. I don't want something close to Aaron Donald or values in that. I want Aaron Donald, okay? So it has to be an exact match. And if it's not, it'll give me an NA, okay? So there we go. Von Miller is with the Broncos. I'll pull down my formula. So that's just a copy and paste function. Just hover over and drag down. It'll copy your formula down. And you'll see that even though these players were in a different order, okay, than the original file, it did pull in each of their respective team names correctly. And so that's the VLOOKUP function. So you see how we said A to B, comma 2, because I wanted column B, which is the second column. Had I wanted Super Bowl wins, we could also do that. So let's change this. Then instead of going, I'm going to do equals VLOOKUP, we're pulling from the player name, looking up the player name. This time I would go all the way over to column 3, right? And I would say comma 3, comma false. Then it will tell me how many Super Bowl wins they have, respectively. So that's the VLOOKUP function. And you'll notice that VLOOKUP can look things from basically some starting point to the right. So it can pull something from a starting column, anything that's over here to the right of that starting column, it can look up. You're going to see in a minute that that has limitations that Xlookup can solve, but let's move on to Hlookup first, and we'll illustrate that. So I'm going to delete my analysis here, and let's go back to team name. All right. This time, so to do an Hlookup, we're going to pull from this tab. All right, and why did I switch to Hlookup when I saw the data presented this way? Why would an Hlookup, I guess, be functional when the data is presented like this? Well, the data is presented in rows, okay? So the teams go across, right? In row 2, Super Bowl wins go across in row 3, and we have the player up top in row 1. So it goes horizontal, right, by row. Our VLOOKUP, all right, the difference is that the information was stored in columns. So column A had all the players. Column B had all the teams. So if it's stored in columns, right, if you have data stored in columns, VLOOKUP can be helpful. If you have data that is stored in rows, you want to use Hlookup, okay? Or, spoiler alert, you could just use Xlookup and it does both. So here we go. Let's do an Hlookup function and then we'll wrap it up with the Xlookup. So if I want to look up Von Miller, I know that my data is stored in rows, so I'm going to say Hlookup. What am I looking up? I'm looking up Von Miller, or the player, right? And I'm going to go to my tab, my Hlookup tab that has all the data stored in rows. And then I'm just going to tell it, I want it to look up this row. All right, so row 1. And I'm trying to pull in the team, so I can stop at row 2, right? And then I'm going to say comma 2 because it's the second row down is my team. However, you could highlight all of it and then say comma 2 as well. Same for VLOOKUP. So you just need to know which row you're pulling from. In this case, it's the second. If I wanted Super Bowl wins, I would obviously highlight at least to there and put comma 3 instead. So what I want to do though is put dollar signs here. And that tells me that it's going to fix the value, all right? The value is going to be locked on rows 1 and 2. That way, when I drag my formula down, you'll see in a second, it won't change the rows I'm looking at. All right, so I'm doing an Hlookup from row 1 to 2, and I'm going to say I want to pull row 2, right? The second value, which is the team name, once it finds this player name. Comma, again, false because we want an exact match. If it does not find this player or an exact match of the player's name, it will come back as NA. And there we go, Von Miller. And let's drag this down. And it works. Let me show you, had I not put my dollar signs here to fix my rows, right? It would pull Von Miller just fine. But when I go to find the other players, I would get an NA. And that's because it is changing my row lookups. Instead of looking up rows 1 and 2, it's actually pulling row 2 and 3, which does not include the player name. So that's the issue there. All right. And okay, so we'll go ahead and undo that so that our player names are all, our team names all show up here. So it's important that if you're dragging down, right, we're dragging our formula down, we needed to make sure whoops, forgot to undo twice. We need to make sure we lock these rows so that when we drag it down, it continues looking up from row 1 or else it won't find the player name in the original Hlookup. Okay, so we have done VLOOKUP, we have done Hlookup. Now we're going to do some Xlookup functions. So I'm going to show you how an Xlookup would be useful with the first data and with the second set of data. So the first data in columns and then the second set of data in rows, and why we might want to use an Xlookup. So a lot of times VLOOKUP and Hlookup would get the job done just fine. But you would have to have your data presented so that anything you're trying to pull in is to the right of your data or below your data. All right, so to the right of your data if you're doing a VLOOKUP, or below your data if you're doing an HLOOKUP. However, what if our data, so in our VLOOKUP, remember, our player name was in column A. So anything to the right we could pull in a VLOOKUP. Pretty simple. But what if, we go to our XLOOKUP tab, the player name is in column D. And what if we wanted to pull in the team name? Well, the team name is to the left of the data, so a VLOOKUP actually wouldn't work. We would have to move our columns, manually manipulate the data, which runs the risk of losing the data's integrity, right? Deleting data. So what we'd want to do actually is perform an XLOOKUP. And this is a newer function that it wasn't around when I was in school, and it would have been nice to have. But now that we do have it, I think it's very useful. And honestly, if you know XLOOKUP, there's not much reason to learn V or HLOOKUP at this point. So let's show how Xlookup can solve our problem if the data that we need is to the left of the player name. So in this case, right, on the Xlookup tab, we have the players in dead center. So if we were trying to do a VLOOKUP, we would only be able to look up data to the right, as I mentioned. So how are we going to solve the problem? Luckily, our handy friend Xlookup has entered the chat. Okay, we have Xlookup, player name. So we're still going to have that lookup value, all right? But what we're going to have now is, instead of having to highlight all of the data you're wanting to pull from, so originally in a VLOOKUP, I would have had to highlight all of these columns. All I need to look up is the column that has the names I need, all right? The names that are going to match the names that are here, all right? So I'm going to say equals Xlookup. We've got Von Miller. All I need to highlight is the player name column. That's the array from which I am pulling, okay? What am I pulling, all right? Then I'm going to tell it what I'm pulling. What do I want to return? What's my return array? So instead of having to highlight the return array in the original lookup function, I'm just going to highlight column A now. Because if I find player name in column D, I'm telling it pull column A's data that matches column D, all right, from my lookup value here, A2. All right, so if it matches the player name, it should pull its respective team, even though team is to the left of the player column. The other good thing about the Xlookup, so remember in VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP, we always said comma false for an exact match. If you want it to not come back NA, if the data is not found, you can actually tell it to say something like team not found. You can tell it to respond with any saying, not just NA. So NA is all the VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP can return if the item that you're trying to match isn't found. But if you use Xlookup, you can actually pull back a different text function, which is very useful when you're trying to pull in certain data and you don't want NAs in your data. So team not found. You can actually go a little further into search mode on how accurate you want it to be, but we're not going to get into that today. So I'm going to hit enter. The team was found, and so we will drag our formula down. And now it has the respective teams of all of the players that we ran an Xlookup on. So what if now, go back to my Xlookup tab. So that is if our original VLOOKUP data had the player name in the middle. But I've also shown you if you're trying to do it with an HLOOKUP, right? But the data you're pulling from, the player name is in the middle. What would you do then, right? So we have the player name, instead of being on the top, all right, it's in the middle. Remember, if you're doing an HLOOKUP, all you can look up is the values below the top column. So the only thing I'd be able to look at would be passing yards, rushing yards, receiving yards, sacks, and touchdowns. I couldn't look up anything above the row that had the lookup function of player name. So what we're going to do, I'm going to delete all of this, and we are going to do an Xlookup. And this time, we're going to look it up by row instead of column. So XLOOKUP can work for both, which is great. So we're going to say this is the array from which we're pulling. Okay, this is our lookup array. When we find a match to one of these names, what do I want it to pull? I want it to pull the team. All right, that's the return array. Okay, comma, team not found if it's not found. Okay, let's see. What did I do? Let's look here. Okay, so make sure in your XLOOKUP that you put the lookup value first before you try to go and start pulling in the arrays. So what array are we pulling from? Let's try this again. We are pulling from the player name, all right? And what do we want it to return? The return array will be the team name. And so even though the team name's above the player name in the rows, we can use the XLOOKUP unlike the HLOOKUP. So we're going to say comma, team not found if it doesn't pull back a team name. And there we are, Broncos or Von Miller and team not found. Why is team not found here? It's because we need, when we're doing anything with rows and we're dragging our formula down, we've got to lock in the row. In this case, we have to start with row 19 as our array to pull from because that is the player name. We have to tell it to stay on row 16 to return the team name. If I didn't lock this one as well, it would start returning like rushing yards, passing yards, MVPs, Super Bowl wins, other values that I don't want. So we've got to lock it. And now when we drag it down, each team name is pulled in. So I will show you, if I didn't lock it, it's going to pull in row 17 for Travis or for Tom Brady. So watch this. So when I drag and it'll show me. So this little green tab is saying, hey, your formula is not consistent with the above. But let's drag it down. So now 7, that's Super Bowl wins. If you pull on down, Peyton Manning, it pulled in probably his MVPs. Yep, Peyton Manning's MVP. So you see how you need to lock your rows. So that's what we're gonna go back and relock all our rows. Boom. Okay, so I hope that you found this helpful. Again, there's really not much reason unless you're already comfortable with V and H lookup and you aren't presented with data that would be in a different order than you need. But if you are just learning, I would highly recommend just focusing on the X lookup because it can really find any of the data that the V and H lookup can, and it's only one formula to know. So I hope that this was helpful. Thank you so much for following along with How To with Haley, and we will be back with some cleaning data in the next video.